Thank you very much for the intro. We're here for the afternoon session, the afternoon closing session. Is this a little bit better? You may have to remind me. I'm used to really being mic'd up with on the lapel. Yesterday, were most of you here yesterday for the crazy storm we were having? And we must have had a session going on at that time. I don't know how you would even been able to hear. So I think we're good that way. But everyone's got coffee, pastries in them. We're ready to go. I'm not spending a lot of time presenting here. We do have a great panel. I'm looking forward to it myself. But I do have what I think are some pretty interesting topics to help set the stage. So what I've listed here is a lot of the impacts that we're experiencing, what our utility industry is experiencing, and customers, the entire market in this energy landscape. And what I tried to list, and I think many of these, maybe not all, are pretty familiar to you, and not always do they all come to mind. So the first three, when I think about technical complications, there's a lot of technical folks here, right? We understand this, and we know that's why we're here and why we're interested in this topic. But the reality is when a grid wasn't designed to behave the way that we need it to now, to serve everyone in society, and this really is an overall societal discussion, is the reality of having high renewable generation providing energy to the grid, and then we're having low load in those cases. All these types of scenarios that come about with high voltage spikes, overload, underload conditions, what that's doing to equipment, what that's doing to reliability, and then power quality in general. Reverse power flow conditions, what issues are that causing? Why is that an issue? But all those things relate to, okay, so I understand there's some of these complications, but now I have customer connection requests, and a customer is requesting to connect a new generation resource, a new high load. Am I able to serve that need at that point? Do I need to do any ramifications to the grid alterations? Do I have enough flexibility to enable that? How do I even validate that? Do I need to go through a process? Do I have those systems in place to do it? And then lack of visibility. This is probably the biggest one. We know at the distribution grid level, medium voltage, low voltage, historically there's been really little telemetry, little understanding and awareness of the actual current state of things on the grid. And then, well, cyber threats, of course, is a big one, especially when you have a lot of new parties coming to the table connecting that aren't utility-owned assets connecting to the grid. And we had a great panel session that just discussed that. But there's also, and I think a lot of us are familiar on the business side of things, that really ramifications of this too. So you have a lot new energy being brought to the grid. Any traditional industry, especially back in the regulated days, and a lot of those markets that are still regulated and maybe vertically integrated, the idea of lack of revenue. So revenue streams are completely changing. Some utilities are in jurisdictions where that's still the only way they're motivated, is how many electrons they're selling. Cost constraints, everything is how do I get more efficient? How do I maximize use of my existing assets? The regulatory, some call it hurdles, but the reality is there's a certain structure in place. We're looking for change. We know change is coming, but what will that change look like? As a distribution grid operator, do I just wait and sit saying, well, until that happens, I really can't make any movement? Or how do I be more proactive and help learn and help move the industry and be best prepared for success overall? The organizational structures in utilities are traditionally not well suited for this. You know, who are the skilled resources they have? This is a lot of new technology. Business processes are changing. The business models are changing. And the culture shift. I work with a lot of utilities that, how do they even incentivize the younger generation that's coming in to voice new ideas, bring innovation, and embrace that? And how do they have a way to really move that forward? These are things that are all quite difficult for an industry that wasn't dealing with this. And so we start thinking about, well, what are all the things that they're then looking to do as a result of this? And several of these, the beginning first half of this list, seems pretty traditional. New effects, new issues related to it, but these are issues that we're dealing with, and the utilities have always had to manage. But then as you start going back a little bit further, the idea of minimizing and deferring investments, that's a little newer. It needs to be done much better. You can't just overbuild as in the past. But the idea to being able to offer or at least enable new types of service. What does that even look like? How are you doing that? What are those types of service? What are they worth? What's the value of them? How do you even quantify these kinds of things when you don't really even understand the implications and the effects? If we want to really enable more and more customers to be like prosumers that want to engage in the market, want to trade, want to participate, want to have more control of their own energy mix, well, how do we do that? How do we enable that? How do we even incentivize the utility to do that? That's part of us all working together. And then ultimately that does lead to new business models. And some of these business models are completely in flux, right? So we'll talk a little bit about that. Generally what we're seeing is an evolution, what we think is a successful way to operate and manage and plan the grid. One of the major parts of this whole discussion. And I mentioned a little bit the idea of visibility. So situational awareness is another thing to say. Do I know where new distributed energy resources are being connected? Do I know their size? Do I know their ownership model? Are these ones that I have a way to communicate with, have some telemetry? Can I dispatch them? Do I understand how to forecast their behavior? Do I understand where more are coming and where I might most likely see that? Can I incentivize or understand where it would be most ideal within the capabilities of grid to have this? So all these things affect a lot of operational planning capabilities. And then you start looking at grid optimization. So now we're starting to say, okay, if I could dispatch and I could optimize not just traditional resources, but all the new emerging grid edge resources, and think about everything as a connected asset, as a connected resource, now you start opening up a whole new possibilities. And that's really what all this flexibility discussion is about. And if you now have a proven infrastructure for how this works and how it can scale, you really do unlock and enable all the other economic optimizations, the market pieces. So at least you say the grid can support these things. The grid the operators understand what's coming, how to support it, how to make changes, how to optimize, how to make requests. All these things start to come together. Now here's an example, and these are some technology abbreviations and phrases, but I can speak to them more generically too. The idea of operations within a distribution utility working in concert with the customer service side. Meaning if I'm providing customer a certain rate and I'm offering different services to a customer, and what are those services? Demand response, there's some of that's actually growing a bit here in Europe, very popular in North America for sure. These services have always been quite independent and isolated from what we do in operations. Operations generally doesn't even know that there's a big load curtailment on the grid, just kind of deals with it. So you start seeing simple workflows that start coming together. Well, this should be shared. If we have situational awareness, then we would like to know all these things, especially planned activities or unplanned. And the idea that we also think of just a load device at a customer site, a thermostat, heater, and so on, water heater, for example, those are all really trying to become a subset, because that's really, demand response is a program in general. Distributed energy resources is saying we're connecting to devices. So all of these things are really falling under the envelope, and all these things are working together. Or at least they're moving in that direction and really need to. On this picture, I can imagine we could have a whole lot of conversation, lots of lively debates. And I'm not going to cover all the aspects that you might think through this, and I'll explain that. So what I'm looking at here is I'm looking at what are ways we need to innovate, what are ways we can promote and move this forward. One of the things you look at, for example, is utilities have a certain amount of direct communications to devices. Certainly things that the utility owns. Some cases on behalf of a customer, they have the ability to remotely offer service and dispatch. And there's different protocols that are emerging around. So how are we working with smart inverter manufacturers? How do they even connect to the grid? How could they provide more value? And what are those messages? What type of information is required? When do I need it? How quickly do I need it? Those are some of the examples. And we also think, and even more common, is more and more of this is not going to be directly utility connected or dispatch, or even have a relationship with the customer. So therefore, working through aggregators, working through other third-party entities that are then going to optimize and manage and have that customer relationship. And so how do you start doing that? What do you do this by groups? Are you managing groups with an aggregator? What kind of information are you sharing? What is the aggregator providing? And what types of groups are we talking about? Is this network hierarchy related? Is this device type? Is this a customer program? And how do you adjust this over time and maintain that kind of synchronization of information? So this is where we see different entities needing to work together, and how we see the industry, and we'll talk a bit about that, is already moving a lot of this forward. What are some standards that are coming about that? And one aspect that we talk about this isn't, now we're not talking about device to device. We're not talking protocols about dispatching a specific resource. We're saying these are generally two enterprise level systems, two head-end type software systems communicating. It should be and can be a much better enterprise level messaging than just using something that I talk to the device this way, we can share information. That seems simple, I can support that. That's changing. And other aspects of this too are, what are the types of devices? Are they just front of meter, behind the meter? What size? What about the ones that we don't dispatch directly? Do we at least understand where they are and estimate their behavior and effects? All these things start to come through. And you'll notice TSO-DSO relationship, I didn't even really include in here. And mostly just because I was looking at, from a network operator, if we're looking at the grid itself as an infrastructure, whatever the political, whatever the commercial entity is and the regulations surrounding that, that has to be maintained to support the society's need. And we're looking at how do we enable that, how do we move that forward, and that's a lot of what we invest our time in. I've listed some examples here of different types of projects that are exposing different aspects of this. And I just picked 4 representative ones, some to give you some different geographies that have different political and regulatory landscapes. One example here in Europe and the UK is active network management. You're probably, some of you, very familiar with. But the idea of transitioning to a DSO, what are the types of services you provide? So it really hits on most of the points I was making. And it does lead to less of a need for network reinforcement or extending the grid, because you can start supporting these changes in this dynamic activity with existing assets, because you have more assets at your disposal. And that leads then maybe to more services you could provide, both to ancillary services and to customer. Because we look at this whole ecosystem, we're saying, well, there's the grid constraints and priorities and needs. There's market request. And there's what is the customer at the end of the day connected? What are their priorities? And how are all these things optimized together? Energy storage dispatch. So Arizona Public Service is a North American example. They don't have regulatory approval to own energy storage throughout the distribution grid. Many utilities think that's a great idea. They understand networks. They could do a lot of flexibility if they could do that. So what is happening, and what we're seeing examples is, well, I need to at least start. I don't know if I will be able to own these in the future or not, but I know I need to be integrating with them, and I need to know how they behave, and I understand how do I best bring value. And so this is the idea of distributed, smaller scale energy storage. And in this case, we're dealing with unbalanced 3-phase networks. So you're talking about single-phase deployments of energy storage, which is also another interesting dynamic. Microgrid, another example. The idea of dispatching and working with a local microgrid controller. So some other system, some other technology provider, could be the same vendor or not, could be a different owner, or could still be owned by the utility. All these dynamics exist. And the idea is, how does that microgrid not just be thinking, okay, I'm optimizing for this location, this facility, these assets to optimize for this specific entity. But if I were to respond to requests externally, how would I optimize that again? How much could I offer? And how would I do that? And a lot of vendors that are working in that space haven't necessarily tested those things out. So this is another example of moving things forward. And then in Australia, a really interesting example of bringing other groups to the table. So the local retailer, the market operator, as well as the distribution system operator and customers, and installing equipment at customer sites and optimizing them for all this benefit. And Australia has really been progressive and really wanting to promote this. And so again, this is all about learning, expanding, being progressive, realizing that we can't control the future, but we can sure participate and understand it better to best be a role player in the future. And I guess with that, we'll move on to the panel.